The famous town of Berdichev was located on the right bank, where a lot of specialists in the conveyor production of all kinds of ancient documents lived. Depending on the wishes of the generosity of the next client, an armful of the oldest-looking documents with signatures and seals, deducing the pedigree of the customer from hardly non-flood times, was hysterical to him in no time. Everything depended on the imagination of the customer. The Capnists, who were known later, having scurried in time, turned out to be descendants of the Venetian Count Capniste, from the island of Zanta, unknown to European history. And nothing passed. Those who turned out to have fewer inventions, without particularly straining their brains, were attributed to some old Polish family, the real representatives of which, presumably, were spinning in coffins. Noble Tatar Mirzas were held in high esteem. One of these, and without batting an eye, appropriated himself as the ancestor of Kakubai. Fortunately, Mirza himself had been resting somewhere for several centuries, and could not protest. Naturally, for the sake of foresight, Polish magnates and Tatar Mirzas were chosen, whose births were stopped long ago, leaving no offspring, so that there was no one to convict. A certain nimble figure claimed to be a descendant of the long-extinct family of the Polish princes of Ostrom. Moreover, he did not show any papers, but simply stated that his ancestors also came from abroad. But there were few of them. Decent people just got papers. The author of the famous novel, Pan Kolyevsky, the classic of Ukrainian literature, Kvitka Osnovyanenko, who wrote, like Gogol, mainly in Russian, bitterly ironized over such an audience. I am now, as we say, a whole lip Pan. A noble ancestor of mine, who was a stoker under some Polish king, hit a mouse that clearly disturbed the noble Pan Krull with a freebie, that is, with a boot, and killed her to death, for which he was immediately granted by a nobleman named Pan Kolyevsky, and his coat of arms was entered in the coat of arms, representing a broken mouse, and a freebie over it. The boot, the weapon that destroyed her, due to the fearlessness of my ancestor. Other pedigrees and family legends differed little from the one that Pan Kolyevsky expounded. The funny thing is that most of these characters were relatively easy to slip into the genealogy books of the provinces. There were too many applicants, and too few specialists in ancient papers. A certain percentage, the most imaginative, did not pass the test, but it was not particularly great. The authorities, however, had heard about something, and therefore, tired of messing with hordes of applicants for nobility, and rummaging through piles of ancient parchments, simply set a specific deadline, after the expiration of which no claims to nobility, no matter how convincing papers were backed up, were no longer accepted. However, at the same time, in a certain history of Rus, composed allegedly in the good old days, but in fact fake, as the author seriously suspects the Little Russian nobleman of politics, the mythical letter of Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich of September 16, 1665 year, is mentioned, where it was allegedly written, "We grant from now on 4 future times, of this host of the Little Russian people from the highest to the lowest elders with their offspring, who were all with us on the campaign near Smolensk, the honor and dignity of our Russian nobles." And according to this letter of commendation, no one from our Russian nobles should in any case lower them against themselves. Such a letter was simply supposed to exist in many copies. But since there was no trace in the Russian archives and the Little Russian ones either, not that there was any mention of this letter at all, they did not take the history of the Rus seriously. The great Russian nobility, having heard about the Burdick arts, for a long time still treated their Little Russian brothers in the class with some mockery. An important clarification: in the times described, no traces of the Ukrainian language can be found. As already mentioned, translators never went with the Tsarist boyars to the hetmanate. Both sides understood each other perfectly without interpreters, well, except that other local words were incomprehensible to one side or the other, but this, as they say, the weather did not do. The language was the same Russian. A brilliant illustration of this statement is the mentioned novel by Kvitka Osnovianenko. Pan Kolyevsky was just the same Ukrainian analogue of von Wyszynski Mitrofanushka, an outstanding ignoramus and ignoramus. With great difficulty, he still somehow learned to read and write, but he had never known any other languages except his native one, and did not want to learn. However, having gone to St. Petersburg in the time of Catherine the Great, neither the Pan himself nor his servant, the illiterate peasant Kuzma, which is noteworthy, do not feel any such language barrier. They communicate with Muscovites in the language they have been speaking since childhood, and they are perfectly understood, just like they are Petersburgers. Only once did a minor linguistic misunderstanding happen. In St. Petersburg, during the day with fire, it was impossible to find a favorite dish, dumplings with cheese, and Pan Kolyevsky sent a servant to the shop to cook dumplings in the hotel with his own hand. In the shop, as soon as they heard about the cheese, they readily offered a hard piece of something strange, in Kuzma's opinion, most similar to soap. After that, we learned that in St. Petersburg, where everything goes delicately and mannerly, our real cheese is called cottage cheese. That's all the language misunderstandings. A little later, some Petersburg pranksters wrote Kuzma with chalk on his back, "This is Kuzma Kokhal." Pan Kolyevsky read this inscription instantly, without straining at all. It was in this language, in Russian, that he was taught to write as a child. Up to the collapse of the monarchy in 1917, interpreters were relied on in all parts of the empire, where the non-great Russian population lived, at administrative bodies and in state courts. Everywhere, except for the Ukrainian provinces, translators were simply not needed there. But we got ahead of ourselves. Let's go back 50 years ago and see how things were with the new Russian campaigns in the Crimea. Under Peter the Great, all the forces and resources of the state were taken away by the long-term Swedish war. Under the successors of Peter, Ekaterina and Peter II, who did not sit on the throne for long, did not raise the question of military expeditions to the Crimea. Only in the middle of the reign of Anna Ionovna, not at all a stupid woman, as many people still consider her to be today, he stood up close. And Turkey was no longer the same, and the Russian troops gained proper military experience, and most importantly, there was a commander who could not be better suited. Field Marshal General Minich, one of the best Russian commanders of the 18th century. In Soviet times, even when the Bolshevik legacy was done away with, and the rehabilitation of both Suvorov and many other military leaders took place, Minich, nevertheless, remained in the shadows. Most likely, it was because he was overshadowed by the successful, and by no means incompetent Russian generals of subsequent times. The winners in the 7 Years' War, who took Berlin, who beat the Turks more than once under Catherine the Great, and first of all, Suvorov. Meanwhile, the military encyclopedia, not inclined to praise in vain and empty-mouthed, assigns 2 large format pages to the Minihu. There are remarkable words there. The personality of Field Marshal Minich is one of the remarkable figures in Russian history, and therefore, I cannot resist, before telling about the new Crimean campaigns, from a brief biography of this outstanding commander, engineer and statesman. So, Count and Field Marshal General Burchard Christopher von Minich. Not only the Russian count's title, but also the German nobility is fresh. The first in the family of the nobility, that is, the right to the prefix von, was received only by Minich's father Anton Gunther, the origin of the most common people. True, the Minas, residents of the Oldenburg County, were by no means cultivators from the Ply. For several generations, the Minich family was engaged in the construction of canals and supervision of them. Engineers without quotes. Minich's sister, along with the nobility, received from the Danish king the title of overseer of dams and water works of the counties of Oldenburg and Delmentgorski. Young Burchard initially followed in his father's footsteps. Already at the age of 16, who became a good mathematician, he was accepted as an engineer into the French service. At 19, he became the chief engineer of the East Friesland Principality. But not for long. There was a passionate love with a maid of honor of the Gauschen-Darmstadt court, whom Minich married. And then he went to war. He fought under the famous generals Duke of Marlborough and Prince Eugene of Savoy. Seriously wounded, promoted to lieutenant colonel for bravery, then to colonel. Engaged in the construction of a canal connecting the rivers Fulda and Weser. But the craving for military service turned out to be stronger than family traditions. Minich enters the service of the King of Poland and the Elector of Saxony, and soon becomes a general at the age of 33. For his efforts to reorganize the Crown Guard, Augustus was strongly disliked in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, as well as his foreign officers for Poles. In Warsaw, Minich kept ringing his sword in duels, no worse than Dumas musketeers. Sometimes he himself was wounded, then he successfully pierced the enemy, sometimes to death, as happened with Colonel Gant. As Louis and Richelieu forgave such amusements to their musketeers, so they were disposed towards Minich. August forgave the young general everything every time. Trouble crept up from an unexpected side. Envious of Minich, the royal favorite Count Fleming hated the young upstart and began to intrigue against him to the fullest. August favored Minich, but nothing more. The Count was much closer to him and had a great influence on the king. Very different weight categories. Russian envoy Dolgorukov appeared here at the most opportune moment and offered Minich the position of engineer general of the Russian service. Minich agreed without hesitation. In Warsaw, he became very uncomfortable. In 1721st year, Minich arrived in St. Petersburg, and from then on for 46 years. Until his death, he worked for Russia. There are many portraits of Minich preserved, but all of them, given the personality and biography of Minich, are more like ceremonial parsons, ennobling the appearance. The painters of that time and their clients loved it. A kind-hearted grandfather from Dickens' novels. Well, he couldn't be like that. After a long search, I found another portrait of Minich in the History of Catherine the Great Bricker, although without specifying the artist's name. This is a real Minich, no doubt about it. Like the face of a kind of 18th-century combat robot, roughly hewn out of a hard log with a blunt cleaver. By order of Peter Minich, he built a lock on the Tosna River, built a bypass canal, paved a road along the Nival from Schlisselburg to St. Petersburg, made plans for the future Rogarvik harbor, then received a more difficult task to finish the Ladoga Canal, which was neither shakily nor valkily tinkered with since 1710th year, brilliantly fulfilled this. Peter used to say, "I have never had such a foreigner in my service who was so able to carry out great plans as Minich." After Peter's death, Minich had a hard time. Menshikov, who had become omnipotent, strongly disliked him. Minich stayed in disgrace for a little while. Upon accession to the throne of Peter II, Minich makes a fair career rise, manages Ingermanland, Karelia and Finland, commands the troops stationed there. Manages and commands, I must say, not bad, receives the dignity of a count and the rank of an Anch general, and a little later, he becomes the head of the military college, that is, the Minister of War of the Empire. In rank, he is younger than all the other managers, but they do not particularly strive to bother themselves with serious work. Somehow it turns out by itself that Minich directs almost single-handedly, without advice from old idlers. He conducts serious reforms, for the first time in the Russian army establishes heavy cavalry, cuirassier regiments, arranges garrison schools with ordinary regiments, where soldiers are taught to read and write, establishes food warehouses and hospitals for military invalids. To the existing 31 fortresses, he adds another 51, strengthens the southern borders, and creates 20 regiments of Ukrainian militia to protect them, establishes the Cadet Corps, the first higher military educational institution in Russia. And most importantly, it corrects a blatant injustice that has dragged on for several decades. Russian officers were found to receive twice as much salary as Russians during the reign of Peter the Great. Minich doubled the Russian salary. And in addition, he ordered from now on to accept into Russian service only those foreign officers who served in the noble European armies, which instantly cuts off all kinds of let's call things by their proper names, Chentropo, who did not seriously sniff gunpowder fortune seekers who received their ranks in some of the puppet German states, where the whole army is sometimes no more companies. Then trouble crept up. The Warsaw story was repeated literally one by one. The all-powerful favorite of Empress Anna, Byron, vulgarly became jealous of the rise and success of Minich, and decided to get rid of an overly popular rival in the army and the country. Baron sent a lot of people into exile on bad, but he did admittedly, not without grace with Minich. He pushed out to command the Russian troops operating in Poland. No, it was done gracefully. You won't dig in and accuse the bureaucrat of tyranny once again. A less experienced military man served in Poland and is well versed in local affairs. In Poland at that time there was another skirmish with two kings contesting each other's crown. Moscow again supported August III, but this was the third. The son of a strong man, the one who once served as a Minich. But the second contender was the same, fairly aged, but restless Stanislav Leszczynski. Only this time, he was supported not by the Swedes, but by the French. Their fleet captured Danzig and fortified it well. Minich did not lose face there either. After the siege, he took Danzig, threw the French out of Poland, and forced the Sejm to proclaim August as king. History is rich in paradoxes, and now the situation turned out to be a little comical. Byron, wanting to make a primitive mess of his opponent without planning it himself, gave Russia an outstanding commander, who hacked the Crimea, did not break the Turks, who was even going to go to Istanbul. However, the march had to be interrupted, peace was signed, and Minich returned to St. Petersburg. New awards: a golden sword with diamonds, the Order of St. Andrew, the rank of lieutenant colonel of the Preobrazhensky regiment, an estate, an annual pension of 5,000 rubles, and all on merit. He settled with Baron after the death of Empress Anna Ivanovna. He took a couple of dozen soldiers and arrested them at night without any ceremony. However, with the accession of Elizabeth came the real trouble, as often happened not only in Russia, with the accession of a new monarch to the throne. In this case, the monarchies began to clean up the former ruling elite. Minich was also taken, but he did not flinch at all under investigation. When he got tired of the tedious and long interrogations of the investigators, Minich threw contemptuously, "Add what you want there yourself." And the rotten fantasy of the judge's hooks started working with might and main. It turns out that Minich, in collusion with Borin, was going to arrest Elizabeth. It's not clear why he arrested Borin himself before that. With the capture of Danzig, he was slow, if you please, because he grabbed a bribe from the French. They also sewed cruel sentences to the military, distribution of ranks to the Germans to the detriment of the Russians, and in addition embezzlement. The sad piquancy consisted in the fact that Minich was accused of extortion by none other than His Serene Highness Prince Nikita Trubetskoy, now a prosecutor, and formerly a military subordinate of Minich, who at one time was personally exposed by Minich in the brutal embezzlement. It was this anti-corruption fighter who itched for a long time and persistently, "Do you plead guilty?" Minich got tired of it, and he barked, "I admit, I'm guilty, that I didn't hang you a thief," at the same time in the Crimean campaign. Minich was sentenced to be quartered. At that time, almost no one knew that Elizabeth, upon her accession to the throne, had vowed not to execute anyone with death, and had faithfully observed it all the years of her reign. Everyone knew something else, that those who go to the block do not return alive. The day of execution has come. The former all-powerful dignitaries, as one, appeared in the most miserable form, overgrown with wild beards, dressed sloppily. Former Chancellor Osterman, seeing the block, fainted, and then a descendant of the two strong Oldenburg engineers goes to die beautifully. Minich, in an immaculate dress uniform, will choose cleanly, casually notices the escort. "I've walked under death too often to be afraid of it." He distributes rings with gems to executioners and soldiers, throws precious snuff boxes into the crowd. Quartering, as well as the death penalty, however, was replaced by eternal exile. The then monarchies are not necessarily. Russians loved this formulation for all time, somehow forgetting that they themselves are not eternal. By an evil irony of fate, in exile in the village of Pilim beyond the Arctic Circle, Minich was settled in the very house that he had designed for the bureaucrat not so long ago. A weak link can kill no worse than hard labor, idleness, longing, hopelessness. In a little over a year, the almighty Menshikov once burned down in a snowy birch tree. Probably, knowing that a very young emperor was sitting on the throne. Alexander Danilovich considered that he would spend many decades in these snows, and broke down. Who knew that very soon the young emperor would die of smallpox? The exiles, including Menshikoff's family, will be returned. Minich, as one would expect from him, did not break down and did not lower his hands. He was 20 years old for all eternity, and all these years he kept himself in excellent shape with tireless work. He planted a vegetable garden, mowed hay, raised chickens, fished, started a school for local children, where he taught mathematics, geometry, engineering, ancient history, and even Latin. He wrote several serious works on the reconstruction of Russia, on the Russian army, on the Ladoga Canal, composed hymns. When Peter III, among the numerous exiles, returned, and Minich, he had already turned 80. But those who met saw not a decrepit wreck, but a vigorous, strong man, who for a long time afterwards twisted by no means platonic romances with court beauties. His extensive love correspondence has been preserved. Other messages, according to historians, for reasons of decency, and now it is better to keep in the storerooms. When Catherine II decided to dethrone her husband from the throne, it was Minich who turned out to be the person who, without exaggeration, could change the course of Russian history. It was he who offered Peter very real plans that promised victory, to ride to the Baltic states, where Rumyantsev's 80,000 army was quartered. The army men, shelled on the fields of the 7 Years' War, who hated the Guards for military affairs, in fact, not a scientist at all, or go to Kronstadt with its strong fleet, capable of entering the Neva River, and proving the Guards that they are grossly wrong with cannon fire in 2 counts. Peter did not dare to do either, but the chances of winning were huge. "Did you want to fight against me?" Catherine will ask a little later, and the Tin Woodman will fearlessly answer exactly the same. "I wanted to sacrifice my life for the sovereign, who restored my freedom." Catherine, the smartest woman, left this audacity without the slightest consequences, just in case. From such a thing, one can expect to military service. She did not allow it, but with her, Minich was in charge of the Ladoga Canal, the Revel, Narva and Kronstadt ports. For another 5 years, he built the Rogarvik harbor. So he died at work. Descendant of 2 strong German peasants, Russian general, engineer, statesman, reformer, brave soldier. The essence of the era also reflects the weapon. The character of Minich most fully corresponds to the officer's sword of the Anensky time. I held one in my hands. Wide and heavy, more like a broadsword, with a cast bronze hilt and thick iron wire, with a deep engraving on the blade, Vivat Anna the Great. The battle swords of later reigns are more beautiful and elegant, but they can only be stabbed. But Anninskaya was capable of splitting any enemy's head in half. It is such a sword that it is appropriate to raise the hilt up to the face, paying homage to the person who hacked the Crimea. Minich hacked the Crimea as if he was opening a tin can with an axe. The first Crimean campaign under Anna Ionovna dates back to 1735 year. Lieutenant General Leontiev was sent to the Black Sea steppes with a 28,000th Corps, who received orders to punish the Nogoi people allied to the Crimea for participating in Tatar raids, and then to put the entire peninsula to the fire and sword. Leontiev, of course, was not a military incompetence, which he proved by deed both before this campaign and later. But the campaign turned out to be unsuccessful. Leontiev carried out the first part of the order correctly. He crushed more than 4,000 Nogais and took a lot of cattle, but then the cold broke out primarily because of them. And not in battles, Leontiev lost more than 9,000 people. The generals subordinate to him showed open disobedience to the commander. Having arbitrarily assembled a military council, they decided to no longer obey Leontiev and retreat. The Corps returned to Ukraine. A special commission, which analyzed the results of an unsuccessful campaign, fully justified Leontiev. And in the next 1736th year, the world moved to the Crimea. Contrary to popular belief, it moved not in one continuous square, with a wagon train surrounded by infantry, but went in 5 columns. And on the 28th of May, Perekop was captured with one decisive blow. Some of his generals advised him to stop here and wait for the wagons, but Minich was tougher than Leontiev, who, by the way, was here under the command of the field marshal, and on his orders, the troops, without hesitation, broke into the Crimea. Now no one and nothing could stop the Tin Woodman. Perekop was taken on the 28th of May, and on the 5th of June, Minich had already taken Yevpatoria. Leontiev, meanwhile, occupied Kinger, where he freed 250 Russian prisoners, captured 49 guns, and a lot of cattle. The Tin Woodman moved forward irresistibly, in the battles that arose here and there, scattering the Tatar cavalry. On the 16th of June, he took the Khan's capital of Bakhchisaray, with its famous palace of the same name, on the wall of which one of the previous Khans must have been a great optimist, ordered to write a long time ago, that the Crimean throne illuminated the whole world with its radiance. Self-confidence, let's just say, excessive. Both the palace and the city were looted by the soldiers. Again, there is no Russian barbarism in this. In those days, this was done with the taken cities of the entire European army. It was considered to be a very good tone. After that, by order of Minich, both the palace and the capital were burned to the ground. Later, in Pushkin's times, Russian travelers in the Crimea. It seems that Pushkin himself left a lot of written memories of the Bakhchisaray palace, which cruelly disappointed them with its appearance. Everyone expected to see something magnificent and majestic, but a rather unsightly building appeared in front of them. Well, by that time they had somehow forgotten that the truly magnificent and majestic Khan's palace was burned to the ground by the Minin, and the subsequent construction, when the former skill was lost, and the Khan no longer had so much money and hired artificial craftsmen, really turned out to be ugly. According to the logic of the war, it was now necessary to occupy Corfu, the strongest fortress in the Crimea, where by that time, all the Turks who fought in the Crimea, naturally, on the side of the Khan, had retreated. It is difficult to say what would have happened with Minich. It is quite possible that the case would have ended with luck. But then the circumstances came into play, which greatly harmed both the previous campaigns and the subsequent ones. Heat, lack of water and provisions, diseases. The Tatars used scorched earth tactics, completely emptying those areas through which the Russian army had to go to the cafe. The wagons marching to Minich from Perekop had no serious military cover, and the steppe cavalry easily intercepted them. The illnesses reached such a scale that a third of Minich's army fell ill, and the remaining two-thirds did not feel the best, were exhausted and hungry. The military council decided to retreat to Perekop, and the Estates, as a sober-minded person, accepted it. Now the army really formed up in one common square, and marched for 10 days to Perekop, ravaging and burning villages that came across on the way, repelling constant attacks of the Tatars. Stubborn Minich wasn't going to leave so easily. He intended to stop at Perekop, and, without leaving the Crimea, replenish supplies, and go with part of the army to Kinburn, to prevent the Turkish army that was gathering there from crossing the Dnieper, and send the other part of the troops back to the Crimea. It didn't work out. Supplies could not be replenished due to the fact that the Tatars were still intercepting wagons and foraging teams. Diseases were spreading. There were not enough provisions and water. The newly assembled military council decided to leave the Crimea, and Minich left, took the troops to winter quarters. The conquest of Crimea failed, but a significant part of the peninsula was completely ruined.